morning, good afternoon, good evening. This message is for March 6, 2022, but you can listen to it anytime you wish, even years later. And we're coming to the conclusion of Paul's second missionary journey. Um, he has hunkered down in Corinth for the longest period of any of this missionary journey, and he was encouraged to do so. He had fear and trepidation. He'd been thrown in jail, he'd been beaten, and he'd been run out of a couple towns, and it was probably working on him. And the Lord encouraged him supernaturally in Acts chapter 18 and verse 9. And the Lord said to Paul in the night by a vision, "Do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking, and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no man will attack you in order to harm you, for I have many people in this city." And he settled there a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. Well, when you have the Lord appear to you, and you have words of encouragement like this, and it can be a watershed time for you. I remember as I was reading in scriptures in Genesis that Jacob was fleeing for his life from his brother Esau, and he came to a place which was later called Bethel, and he laid his head down, and as you lay down, your head kind of goes back, so you put a rock under it or something. And he had a dream, and in this dream there was a bridge or a walkway, a staircase from heaven down to earth, angels ascending and descending, and it was the bridge to heaven. And he woke up and he said, "Surely God is in this place." And he took his precious oil and he anointed that rock that he had been sleeping on. And he said, "Surely this is the house of God." And he made a vow, and he said, "If you keep me safe," for he was going to an uncertain place. He'd never been there before, and I was going to find Laban and his family. "And if you keep me safe and bring me back, and you will be my God, and I will be your servant." And he made a vow of sorts. And there are things that happen in people's lives that cause them to make significant decisions and efforts. And I'll say more about this a little bit later on. But for Saul, this could have been this very time. For somewhere along the line, Paul had made a Nazarite vow. Now, it doesn't use the word Nazarite, but as you look at it and all the indications with the cutting of his hair and everything, it appears that he made a Nazarite vow, and this could have been because of this religious experience that he had at this time. So he was now concluding his ministry at Corinth, and he was going to now go back and report what had happened in this 3 to 4 year trip he had made, swinging over there into Macedonia. And verse 18 of Acts 18, it says, "Paul, having remained many days longer," it was when Sosthenes had taken Paul before the magistrate, and they threw it out. And Sosthenes himself had gotten beaten for it by, I believe, his fellow Jews. Some think it was Greeks, other Greeks, not Jewish people, but I think it was his fellow Jews. That's my take as I read it. They could have been Greek too, but they were Jewish. And it says, "Paul, having remained many days longer after this, took leave of the brethren and put out to sea for Syria," which is where Antioch is, the sending church, "and with him were Priscilla and Aquila." So he was leaving this church now that he had been at least 18 months. But this church had leadership, and he could leave it in good hands. How do I know that they had leadership? Well, I know that Crispus, who had been the leader of the synagogue in Corinth, got saved. I know that Sosthenes, who was now the leader after Crispus had left the synagogue, he got saved. I also know that a man named Gaius was there. If you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 1, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, and looking at verse 16, it said, now I, 1 Corinthians 1 and 14, it said, I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius. So Crispus was the leader of the synagogue, and Gaius, so that no one would say, you were baptized in my name. No, I did not baptize, I did baptize also the household of Stephanus. Beyond that, I do not know whether I baptized any other. So he mentioned Crispus, Gaius, and Stephanus and his household. And so there were some leaders there. If you were to look at chapter 16 of 1 Corinthians, and he was mentioning people at the very end, and in chapter 16, starting with verse 15, he says, Now I urge you, brethren, you know the household of Stephanus, that they were the first fruits of Achaia, and that they have devoted themselves for ministry to the saints, that you also be in subjection to such men, and to everyone who helps in the work and labors. I rejoice over the coming of Stephanus, and for Tunatus and Achaicus, because they have supplied what was lacking on your part, for they have refreshed my spirit and yours, therefore acknowledge such men. Now, these three men had gone across the sea from Corinth to the area where Paul was now on a third missionary journey at Ephesus, and they had brought a little something to bless him, some support and blessings from the church at Corinth, and also quite a bit of news, and thus he wrote this letter, you see, and probably sent it back with them. But these men were leaders, and Stephanus was one of them. And then if you were to look at Romans chapter 16, and he was writing this letter some years later from to the Romans, and it says in Romans 16 and verse 23, Gaius, host to me and to the whole church, greets you. Now that means that Gaius, this Gaius that he had baptized, that he mentions in 1 Corinthians, he was the person who'd opened up to his house so that they could have a place for the church to meet, and they met in his house. He must have been a well-to-do man or a very generous man who opened up his house to a lot of people. So you had Crispus and Sosthenes, who had been leaders in the Jewish synagogue, knew the Old Testament Bible, and had become saved. And that's the skill and the temperament that they had in leading the synagogue also was holding them in good stead to help in the church. Gaius was a leader, and also this man named Stephanus, who was a minister. So there were quite a few people there. And so he left that church in good hands. Now, Uh, if you don't have people who have been spending all of their life in the Word of God and you get them saved, they're not going to have such a quick turnaround to be ready to lead a church. And so these leaders in the synagogue who were then saved and got their minds straightened out and who the Christ was, they knew the Bible and they also, therefore, were used to leadership. And so there was a lot of good leadership in a short period turnaround. Um, I have trained men, and they have taken over the churches. And then I've gone on to another place, trained men, and they've taken over the church. And it could take 7 years to get a man ready when they don't have that synagogue leadership experience. But at any rate, there was a necessity to train these men, and he left them this church in good hands. He felt reasonably comfortable that he could take Aquila and Priscilla with him. He wasn't taking too much out of the church when he took them with him. They might have wanted to go anyway. And it says here that he was leaving the brethren. He put out to sea for Syria, and with him were Priscilla and Aquila. In Cenchrea, he had his hair cut, for he was keeping a vow. Now, the original language is most faithfully reproduced in the King James Version, and it says, and with him Priscilla and Aquila, having shorn his head in Cenchrea, for he had a vow. I looked at the original language, and that's closest to it word for word. But here it says, for he was keeping a vow. And then if you look at the NIV, it says, they had his hair cut off at Cenchrea because of a vow he had taken. And I'm here to tell you, all three of those are good translations. They're just struggling to tell you everything that passage means. And so I'm going to break it down for you. And what it is that I'm going to tell you is this. I believe it was very likely when the Lord had appeared to Paul and said, don't be afraid. I have many people here, and no one's going to beat you. And he decided to take a vow of thanksgiving to God because he'd been chased out of Berea. He'd been chased out of Thessalonica. He'd been asked to leave. He'd been beaten there at Philippi. And at Athens, really nothing happened too much to speak of. And so here he was here in fear and trepidation, not knowing whether anything of what he did was going to last. And God had encouraged him. And he, I believe, took a vow at that time. And this vow was probably a Nazirite vow. As you know, one of the main parts of a Nazirite vow, there are three actually, but parts of it, but one of the main parts is you don't cut your hair. And then you don't touch anybody that's dead, and you don't drink or eat anything that has to do with the fruit of the vine. Now, you say, well, Pastor, didn't you just say that he wasn't supposed to cut his hair? And here it says he did. Yes, he cut his hair because his vow had been finished. He had run his course. He had ended his time at Corinth, and he probably had let that hair grow for up to 18 months, and he shaved it off. And remember, it says, for he was keeping a vow. Part of that vow, once you get to the time element where the vow is ended, you cut your hair off because the vow now is ended. Then, if you are far displaced, you have up to 30 days to take this hair over to the temple as a sacrifice unto God. They take this hair and actually put it on the altar and burn it as a sacrifice unto God. So all of these passages are kind of struggling. Yes, he had taken a vow. Yes, he was keeping a vow. And part of that was to take this hair within the 30 days of him cutting his hair and get it to Jerusalem. So he had a limited amount of time, and he had 1,000-mile journey ahead of him. Now, 1,000-mile journey back at that time was more involved than 1,000-mile journey here. We could get on an airplane and cover 1,000 miles in a couple hours. But back at that time, when you had travel by walking and ship and things like this, 1,000-mile journey, especially if you had bad weather getting in the way, could take you uh, half of a month or more anyway, depending on how and rugged the terrain and rugged the situation, the weather, and also the availability of the transportation available. So he didn't want to cut it too close. So when he is traveling with Priscilla and Aquila, for some reason or another, they wanted to go to Ephesus. It was a major town. Maybe they felt like they had sold as many tents as they could. Maybe they wanted a change of scenery. Maybe they had, perhaps in the back of their mind, that they would get involved and maybe witness over there at that synagogue. Could have been any number of things. And so in verse 19, they came to Ephesus, and he left them there. Now he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. Ephesus was a major town, and he preached in the synagogue. They had a synagogue there. And he reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to stay for a longer time, he did not consent. Well, he had to get down to Jerusalem, you see. But taking leave of them and saying, I will return to you again if God wills, he set sail from Ephesus. Oh, my friends, sometimes when you're closing a chapter in your life, God sometimes gives you a little hint as to what might be happening or what he wants of you in the future. And he lets that kind of ferment and lets that kind of be in your mind until the time is right. For he had closed the door for them to go into Ephesus. They originally were trying to go into that area, and he closed the door and had them go up into Macedonia. Well, now it looked like a little crack in the door was open, and they had invited him back, and so this was in the back of his mind. Um, so when he landed at Caesarea, which is the coast town that was built by Herod because he wanted to cozy up to the Romans, and Caesarea has the word Caesar, so it was kind of Caesar's place, and it was a Roman place, a port that gave them easy access to the heart of Israel. And so they landed there. He went up. Now, when you land at the seacoast and you go up, what are they saying? They are saying that he went up to Jerusalem, where the temple is, although they didn't use the word Jerusalem there. So he went up and greeted the church, the Jerusalem church. He also went to the temple, and I'm sure he told them about what had transpired on this trip, and they were very much interested in what was going on. So he did that and went down to Antioch. Now, that technically is north. A lot of us would call that up. But geographically, elevation-wise, is down. And so he went down to Antioch, although it was north. That was the original sending church. And he spoke to them and shared and stayed there some good while. So Paul takes this vow, and then when he finishes his course of his second missionary journey, and he's going to go back to Jerusalem and then on up to Antioch, the sending church, he cuts his hair. He stops a little bit at Ephesus. Priscilla and Aquila hunker down there. He speaks in the synagogue, and they say, "We'd like you to speak more to us about this." And he said, "Well, I can't. I have to go. But if God wills, I'll be back." He goes down, lands at Caesarea, makes his way up to the church, spends some time in Jerusalem, and then he does his vow, of course, at the tabernacle, the temple, and he makes his way up. And from start to finish, that took about 3.5 to 4 years. Now, this has become a kind of a pattern for missionaries. They go 3 to 4 years, and then they come back on what's called furlough, and they report to the churches, and they tell how things are going, and then perhaps then they reload on God's will, and they go back to that mission field or to another place, and so this is where we get that 3 to 4 years is from the pattern that Paul set here. Um, now, a little bit about this Nazarite vow that was taken to express deep devotion and appreciation. You will have times in your life where perhaps you got cancer and God healed you. You lost your job and God gave you a different one. There might be a major change in your family. It might be that a sermon got through in your mind and it just worked on you and the Spirit of God was teaching you. It might be that you were reading something in the scriptures and it came through to you. It might be you get to a different stage in your life. Perhaps you come to retirement. And all of these things have happened to me. Also, I've had things that were happening to me. I got cancer in 1998. I was found to have cancer. My wife had it in 96. I believe that's the timing. And so she had her cancer surgery, and then I had my cancer surgery in 1998. And we went through quite a situation where we didn't even know we were going to be around long enough to raise our 13-year-old daughter to be 18. We didn't know. We dedicate ourselves to God. We ask for His mercy and His grace, and God gave us that grace. Now we're 20, 25 years later from our operations, and God is still giving us the opportunity. But as I had just completed my doctorate, and now I had cancer, and I was wondering, well, God, is this it? Are you calling me to be with you? And that's okay. But I certainly would love to serve you if you leave me here on this earth. And that's what he did. And so I had an opportunity to open myself up. And although I have to say I'm somewhat of a chicken when it comes to going to foreign lands and flying and going into foreign countries and all of the examinations you have to do and the testings and checking your luggage and getting the shots and eating different food and stuff. And this is not something that appeals to me. I like sameness. But I opened myself up and I was invited to come and teach in a seminary for a month in Africa. And I said yes. Um, when I came back, I just had a different perspective. It had expanded my thinking in many, many ways. And then I went back in 2007 to Africa again because it was needful. They needed me. And so I went. And there were other also times of evaluation. Empty nest when all my girls were out of the house. Having trained the men and they could take over at this church, did God want me someplace else? And that was the case. And then having trained another man at that next church I went to, did God want me someplace else? I was at retirement age. I tried semi-retirement, didn't really like it. And then God called me up here to the church I presently am at, Alto, Calvary Grace Brethren Church. But I also had stages in my life where I would evaluate myself yearly, and usually that was at camp and conference. I was away from the church. I had an opportunity to go forward, perhaps, and rededicate my life or pray more than I usually would, and just spending time out at camp and all of these things. It was a time of evaluation. And we go through those things, and God uses those things to kind of shake us loose a little bit and retool ourselves, um, to rethink and reload on what God's will is for our life. So, this is a very important time. We go through all of these times. Just in Paul's ministry, you saw it. And Aquila and Priscilla, they had their life turned upside down by meeting the Apostle Paul, and they're opening themselves up to being used. We find out later on that the church meets in their home, or they can just put up a tent and people can meet there. They sponsored churches in their home, and so when you meet the Lord and He gets a hold of your life, it improves it so very much, and your life just, you never really see things as the same. You're not here on earth just to have a yeehaw good time. You're on this earth to glorify God. And when you get about to glorifying the Lord with your life, friend, you are really starting to live. And you will never regret whatever it is that you do for the Lord. Maybe it's just taking on a ministry in the church that you hadn't done before. Maybe it's stepping up to teach Sunday school. Maybe it's allowing yourself to be a deacon or a trustee. Maybe it's signing up to help with a home Bible study or going out on a visitation team, but you're stepping up. Maybe you're increasing your giving. Any number of things, but you are deciding that you're going to live for God and be involved in this. Maybe you want to launch out and help plant a church. Those are exciting times. Hard work, but exciting as well. So Paul makes his way finally back to his sending church at Antioch, and he, I'm sure, spends a period of time there. It says, but taking leave of them and saying, I will return again to you if God wills. So he goes to Antioch in verse 23, and having spent some time there, he left and passed successively through the Galatian region and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. And you know where he ended up? Ephesus, which starts the third missionary journey. Now, this mission trip was 1,500 miles one way. And I have a map here, and there's usually on the back of these 8 sermons that I preached. And so this 1,500 miles from Antioch all the way to Corinth. And then there was 1,000 miles to go back to Caesarea and up to Jerusalem. And then, of course, he had some miles he had to make up to Antioch. So it might be more like 1,200 miles, but a 2,700-mile circuit. And it's important to take stock of your journey. What would he say when he came to Antioch? he would probably have a number of churches there in Antioch, meeting here and there and everywhere, a lot of home churches. There were a lot of believers there in Antioch. And he probably said, well, we gained some helpers. We picked up Timothy, and Timothy might have been with him for all I know. And Timothy might have had a couple things he would have to say. They picked up Luke. Luke then abided there at Philippi and helped anchor that place. And of course, Timothy and Silas, or Silvanus is his full name, they were involved in Thessalonica and Berea, and then over there at Corinth. And they would make trips back to kind of re energize and check on Thessalonica, take some letters there or news back to Paul. And so they were mother henning over these four churches and getting them up and flying. So we know there was a church at Philippi, one at Thessalonica, one at Berea. Athens we're not quite sure of. There were some converts, and then of course Corinth had. He was there quite a bit, and it was a very gifted church. And he came back then and told about that. He told about being thrown in jail, and then the prison being shaken, and the Philippian jailer being saved, and the church getting on its feet, and how generous that group of churches were to help him, that church, so that he could go to Thessalonica and then to Berea and to Athens and Corinth. He talked about Thessalonica and then how he got chased out of there, but they were able to, on the low, down low, work with them through Timothy and also Silvanus, Berea. Then he got chased out of there. He had a chance to speak at Mars Hill. There were some converts there, and then he landed in Corinth. And 4 churches in 4 years, perhaps 5. Praise the Lord. Tremendous. We have things like that happening right now in Africa. Um, there is one gentleman that he is a wheelchair-bound man. He had polio. He can't walk. He has to be in a wheelchair that he paddles with his hands. And yet this man himself, in the 7 years that I've known about him, has planted that many churches, 1 church a year. And then there was Gilbert Amaswashi, and he's been involved in planting many churches. And Roger Yoda, and all these men are planting churches, and there's many, many churches being planted in Cameroon, and churches being planted in India, and churches being planted in Myanmar and wherever. So we praise the Lord. These things are going forward. Now, it doesn't happen that fast in the United States of America. I pray that there's a revival where it comes around and this happens again. But nevertheless, it does not excuse us from trying. And we have evangelistic efforts we're doing in this church, trying to reach Alto and also Freeport. And Danny is moving down the Freeport Road, and he's almost at the edge of Freeport now, some 3 miles away, having witnessed to everyone in between, and he's about ready to reach that town. So it's exciting, we take stock of things. It's important to evaluate our lives, and this is something I tried to do also in our personal lives. I would take the last Sunday of the year off, and so we would it was a staycation. So we wouldn't go to church, but we'd have our own little church there at our house, and I would have an evaluation of my 3 daughters. I talked to them about how proud I was of them and the progress they were making. I wouldn't say negative stuff, and I'd encourage my daughters and try and tell them that we see what they're doing and we see how they're trying. And it was great that they did a solo in the church, and didn't they have a great time at camp, and they get good grades, and they have a paper route, and they're taking care of their pets or whatever. And my wife and I, we did it for ourselves as well, and we did that for many years, encouraging our children and taking stock. And then it's important to thank God and to reload in God's will. And here, God gives the Apostle Paul a little window to help him know that maybe this is what's going to be happening next. He should go to Ephesus. And he was there at Ephesus on his third missionary journey and evangelized that whole Asia Minor. And as he was there, and some other situations, he began to think, I'd like to go to Rome. I'd like to get over to Spain. I'd like to go to Tarsus. And his heart was leading him on, and he was always reloading with God's will in his mind. Don't be static. Don't think, well, I'm retired now. There's nothing to do. My friend, that could be a brand new opportunity for you to do some things that you'd long to do and to be involved in the Lord's work more than you ever had been before. God's blessing as you take stock of your situation in your life and you reload on what the will of God is for your life.